back to Globalogs. This is going to be our second episode on the Venezuela narrative. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the Venezuelan oil industry, its history, and its relationship to state power, and why it's still important for understanding Venezuela today. So, the long and the short of it is that oil has been, for the last 100 years, essentially, the seat of the power of the Venezuelan state. It is the most important source of money, it is the most important concentration of the elites, and it's what makes state and society run, for better and for worse. Oil had been known about in Venezuela for centuries. It had been observed by locals and then by Europeans when they arrived. But first serious exploitation of oil came just around the turn of the 20th century. But it was on a relatively small scale. It didn't really get big until the 1920s, when a major gusher, there it is, was discovered on the shores of Lake Maracaibo in western Venezuela. And within just a few short years, by 1926, oil was Venezuela's leading export, and by 1935, Venezuela was the leading oil exporter in the entire world. And overwhelmingly, these exports went to the United States, although it was also an important exporter to Britain and also to other countries in Europe. The early years of the Venezuelan oil industry, the big important years, were overseen by this man, General Gomez, who was sort of your prototypical modernizing dictator. He took charge and ran Venezuela essentially as his private wealth generation machine. But he did create stability, and he did use money generated by the oil industry to fund various kinds of modernization projects. And because he created so much stability, he was very favored by the international oil companies, who in other parts of Latin America found less stability than they'd get in Venezuela. Importantly, though, Venezuela was also a pioneer in other aspects of the oil industry. Though we think of it as pretty normal today to have profits from an oil company split with the host government where the oil is being extracted, it was not normal for a long time. And in fact, Venezuela was the one who developed it. And in the 1940s, struck deals with U.S. companies for the famous 50-50 split. No foreign companies had ever done this before with a host government, but after their rather disastrous experience in Mexico, where President Cardenas nationalized the entire Mexican oil industry in 1938, they were willing to say, well, 50% is better than 0%, so let's move ahead with it. Venezuela was further a pioneer in the oil industry in 1960, when they began the shift that has endured to the present day of the power in the oil industry moving away from private companies, the so-called Seven Sisters, to national governments and to national oil companies. And when it helped found OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, along with Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. That's how important Venezuela was in the oil industry then. It was the only non-Persian Gulf country to be a founding member of OPEC. Having pioneered this 50-50 split idea in the 40s, and following the progress of the oil industry then through OPEC in the 60s, Venezuela then went in all out and nationalized the whole industry in 1976, turning it into what it is today, PDVSA, Petroleras de Venezuela, S.A. And at the time, this was not seen as radical a nationalization as had been attempted in, say, Iran under Mossadegh, or various other attempts. But, the oil industry, as I said, remained the seat of state power, remained the most important export industry, the most important generator of cash, and the industry with the strongest ties to the status quo and the strongest ties to the United States in particular. And so when Hugo Chavez was elected in '98 and then re-elected and strengthened his populist policies, the oil industry was rather resistant to what he was doing, and in fact staged a formal sort of non-production protest against him in 2003, which prompted him to then summarily fire about 19,000 members of PDVSA, and production levels in the country dropped about 20%, and they haven't really recovered yet from that. And in fact, the Colombian oil industry right next door owes a lot of its success over the last decade to this firing of Venezuelan oil engineers, because they all sought jobs immediately next door. But one thing that's important to note about Venezuelan oil is that it's relatively expensive to produce. One of the major advantages that Saudi Arabia and the other countries of the Persian Gulf have is that their oil is not simply abundant, it's cheap. Venezuela actually has greater oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, but their oil is significantly more expensive to extract. And when you add on top of this the various subsidies for daily life in Venezuela, like the world's cheapest gasoline and subsidized electricity and other kinds of things, the Venezuelan government has a break-even price on oil production of over $150 a barrel. And, in sort of a structural circumstance where oil is likely to be significantly below that for a while, the Venezuelan state simply doesn't have the money from this thing that it has always depended on to pay for these things. And of course, the important thing to remember here is what I said at the outset of this video, which is that since it has been around, the oil industry has been the seat of state power in Venezuela. Whether that has driven the modernizing kleptocracy of Gomez back in the early 20th century, or the U.S.-leaning foreign policy that dominated the second half of the 20th century, or the socialist populist reforms of Chavez, it has all come from the oil industry. And its role now in trying to prop up these subsidized parts of the Venezuelan economy that it can't really with the structurally low oil price doesn't change its fundamental role. And that's why I thought it was important to devote an entire episode to it, because everything in the history of Venezuela is bound up in it, and the present, and at least the near future. So that's what it is. Thanks for watching this video. As always, like, subscribe, share, do all the other stuff. I realize I don't say that at the end of every episode, but I really should start doing that. So thanks for watching, and see you all next time when we talk about the life and rise of Hugo Chavez. Thanks a lot.